one of the main things, and this is where the data discussion comes in, is to make it public. So moving from a situation where one person in a school community is the sole charge position of data, and that I know as a former secondary teacher that is the history of secondary schools. One person would, often the principal, for example, would look at the data, would interpret the data, and would present his or her interpretations of those data. And I think that's risky, partly because it doesn't involve anyone else, and addressing the data is always going to be a shared responsibility, but also because one person alone will never be able to just pick up accurately all the patterns in the data. We'll all bring our own preconceptions and our blind spots, and someone else might identify a specific pattern that someone else has overlooked, or they might have for example say something in a data discussion that shows that they've misinterpreted the data, and that happens. Two big things I see that I worry about. One is people relying too much on a single source of data, and so in our work we use a lot of standardised measures of reading, writing, mathematics achievement, for example, but and using a single source of information is problematic for at least two main reasons. One reason is that with all the learning areas and all the key competencies and achievement objectives we've got available in the New Zealand curriculum, just focusing on reading, writing and mathematics is always going to be a narrowing of the curriculum and not capturing the richness of what we want to achieve for our students. Secondly, it's too narrow. It's too narrow even within those domains, because doing well in a PAT reading comprehension test doesn't tell me as a teacher everything I want to know about my students' reading. I want to know about their attitudes about reading as well as their achievement. I want to know about how well they can read a wider range of text than in a test. I want to know how they can read and how well they get on with reading in other situations apart from constrained time-bound tests. So that's one of the big mistakes. So I think sometimes we over-privilege certain types of tests, particularly standardised tests, where I value them, but they're only one part of the puzzle. The second thing I think that people often who are fairly new to statistics do is they attribute too much to means and medians. So those are measures of central tendency. So, looking at average achievement. And if you do that, it just masks so much of what's going on in your class. Two classes, for example, with the same average can have very different patterns of achievement. It might be if there was an assessment and it was marked out of 10 for simplicity's sake, it could be that the mean might be 5, and that might be because most of the children are scoring 4, 5 or 6. Or you could have a mean of 5 and there's half the class is scoring 9 and 10 and the other half of the class is scoring 1 or 2, and you still get the same mean. So if you don't actually look at the variability in the data, you'll draw some very incorrect conclusions about the data. Some of the technical language around this is the idea of aggregation and disaggregation. So aggregation with this is just putting all the highest level of aggregation is putting all the children together in the mix. And so if it was a school, for example, you might look at it and say, how are children at this school doing in reading, for example? and then you might start, and that tells you really useful information about how the schools are doing in reading overall. But then at some point you want to drill down or delve into that data, and so you go down into different levels and different groupings. So for example, an obvious place to start would be you'd look at year levels, and then you might identify, as a lot of schools have identified, our children in year 1 to year 6 are making really great progress in reading, and then their reading plateaus in year 7 and 8, for example. So looking at year levels tells you something different. Then within those year levels, it's likely that different classrooms, they'll have different patterns of achievement associated with them. Now that's not to, it's a mistake, and this might be another mistake that school leaders in particular can fall into, is oversimplify the relationship between student learning and student teaching. So they identify variability in patterns of achievement or progress.